On the 10th of December, 2008, a father asks his two grown sons to come to his Manhattan apartment. For weeks the market has been falling. Nervous clients have been asking for their money back, billions of it. And the man at the center of it all can no longer make the numbers work, so he tells them the truth. According to the criminal case federal prosecutors would later file, the investment business the family had run for decades, the one that had made him a Wall Street elder, a former chairman of the NASDAQ stock market, a name whispered with envy from Palm Beach to Geneva, was a lie. There were no investments. There had never been any investments. It was, in his own reported words to his sons, one big lie. The sons went to the authorities. The next morning, agents arrested Bernard Lawrence Madoff at his home. Prosecutors would go on to describe a fraud that had run for years and left thousands of investors believing they collectively held nearly $65 billion. Money that, in reality, was gone. This is the story of how one man faked decades of profit, how a whistleblower begged regulators to look and was ignored, and how the largest Ponzi scheme ever uncovered finally ran out of other people's money. To understand the scale of it, you have to understand the trust. Bernard Madoff was not a fly-by-night operator. He founded his firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, in 1960. Over the following decades, he became a genuine pioneer of electronic trading and a fixture of the financial establishment. He served, at one point, as chairman of the NASDAQ stock market. His legitimate trading operation was real and respected. But alongside it sat a separate investment advisory business, and it was that business, prosecutors would later say, that had become a fraud. Madoff managed money for a remarkable roster of clients: charities and university endowments, pension funds, celebrities, and thousands of ordinary retirees who had handed him their savings, often on the recommendation of a friend. What drew them was consistency. According to the record that later emerged, Madoff claimed to use a strategy called a split-strike conversion, a real options technique meant to produce steady, modest gains while cushioning against market drops. The results he reported were almost impossibly smooth, positive returns year after year, in good markets and bad, rarely a losing month. To many clients, that steadiness was the whole appeal. To a handful of outsiders who looked closely at the numbers, it was the first sign that something was impossible. At its core, what prosecutors described was one of the oldest frauds there is, a Ponzi scheme, named for the 1920s swindler Charles Ponzi. The mechanics are simple, and that is part of what makes them so devastating. A Ponzi scheme does not invest anyone's money. When a new client hands over a deposit, that cash is not put to work in the market. It sits in a bank account. When an older client asks to withdraw funds or take a profit, they are paid. But they are paid out of the incoming deposits of newer clients. As long as more money keeps coming in than goes out, the illusion holds. The moment withdrawals outpace deposits, it collapses. According to prosecutors and the firm's own later reckoning, that is exactly what Madoff's advisory business had become. The trades on his clients' account statements were never made. The strategy he claimed to run was, in practice, not being run at all. Instead, a back-office operation generated paperwork, account statements, and trade confirmations for transactions that had never happened, designed to match the steady returns clients expected to see. Federal filings describe how deep the fabrication ran. Clients received detailed statements showing specific stock purchases at specific prices. Those documents were, according to the government, invented after the fact. By the end, roughly 4,800 client accounts held statements reflecting balances of nearly $65 billion. The actual principal that investors had put in was far smaller, and even that had largely been paid back out to earlier investors or drawn down over the years. A few people helped keep the machine running, according to the charges that followed. Frank DePascali, a longtime Madoff lieutenant who had started at the firm as a teenager, later pleaded guilty and admitted helping to create the false records. The firm's outside auditor, an accountant named David Freeling, operated out of a tiny suburban storefront and, according to his own guilty plea, essentially rubber-stamped Madoff's filings without conducting real audits, a one-man shop signing off on billions of dollars in claimed assets. And for years, that was enough. The statements looked real. The returns looked steady. The name Madoff opened doors. As long as new money kept arriving, no one on the outside could see that behind the paperwork there was nothing at all. Here is the part of the story that still stings. Someone did see it, and said so, for nearly a decade. His name was Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst in Boston. Beginning around 1999, he studied Madoff's reported returns and concluded they were mathematically impossible to produce honestly. He took his concerns to the Securities and Exchange Commission, not once, but repeatedly over the years, in increasingly detailed submissions, including a memo whose title flatly warned that the firm was the world's largest hedge fund fraud. The SEC did not stop Madoff. After the collapse, the agency's own Inspector General investigated why. The resulting report, released on August 31, 2009, found that over roughly 16 years, the Commission had received numerous credible complaints and conducted several examinations and investigations of Madoff, and never uncovered the fraud. According to the report's findings, investigators did not understand the business they were examining. Separate teams failed to share what they knew, and basic follow-up simply never happened. The failure became the subject of Senate hearings and a national embarrassment for the regulator. In the end, it was not a regulator that brought Madoff down. It was the math of his own scheme meeting the financial crisis of 2008. As markets crashed that autumn, frightened investors tried to pull roughly $7 billion out at once. The incoming deposits that had always covered the outflows dried up. There was no reserve of real investments to sell because there were no real investments. The scheme had finally run out of other people's money. And so, in December, Madoff confessed to his sons, and his sons turned him in. The legal resolution came quickly, and then stretched out for years in its aftermath. On March 12, 2009, Bernard Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felony counts, among them securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, perjury, and making false filings with the SEC. There was no plea deal. He pleaded guilty to everything, with no agreement to cooperate in exchange for leniency. On June 29, 2009, a federal judge in Manhattan sentenced him to 150 years in prison, the maximum, arrived at by stacking the maximum term for each count one on top of another. The judge called the crimes extraordinarily evil. Madoff was also subject to a forfeiture order in the billions, and the court entered a money judgment reflecting the vast sums that had flowed through the scheme. Others faced consequences too. According to court records, Frank DePascali pleaded guilty in 2009 and agreed to cooperate, but died in 2015 before he was ever sentenced. David Freeling, the auditor, pleaded guilty and cooperated extensively. He was ultimately sentenced in 2015 to a term of home detention and supervised release, his cooperation cited as a major factor. Recovering the money became its own long saga, on two separate tracks. A court-appointed trustee, Irving Picard, was tasked with clawing back funds through the bankruptcy of Madoff's firm, suing those who had withdrawn more than they put in, and pursuing the banks and feeder funds that had channeled money to Madoff. Separately, the Department of Justice created the Madoff Victim Fund, overseen by former SEC Chairman Richard Breeden, to distribute forfeited assets. According to the Justice Department, that fund completed its final distribution at the end of 2024, having returned more than $4.3 billion to tens of thousands of victims, an average recovery of more than 90% of their proven losses. The trustee's separate recovery effort has returned billions more. As of July 2026, that trustee-led recovery and its periodic distributions to claim holders remain ongoing and unresolved. The liquidation has not been formally closed, and additional distributions were still being made. No final total should be implied. The human toll ran deeper than money. Madoff's own family fractured. His son Mark died by suicide in December 2010, 2 years to the day after his father's arrest. His son Andrew died of cancer in 2014. Bernard Madoff himself died in federal prison in Butner, North Carolina, on April 14, 2021, at the age of 82, while still serving his sentence. It is tempting to explain Madoff away as a singular monster, a uniquely gifted liar who fooled everyone. But the record suggests something less comforting. He was not, in fact, invisible. A private analyst worked out the fraud years in advance and handed regulators a roadmap. The warning signs were there: returns too smooth to be real, a multi-billion-dollar operation audited by a single accountant in a strip mall, a secretive investment business that famously discouraged questions. What was missing was not evidence. What was missing was scrutiny. The willingness of investors, feeder funds, and regulators to look past a trusted name and a steady statement. That is the uncomfortable lesson of Madoff. The scheme did not survive for so long because it was sophisticated. In its mechanics, it was crude. One of the oldest cons in finance. It survived because reputation did the work that due diligence was supposed to do, and because everyone assumed someone else had already checked. Trust, in the end, was the product he was really selling. And trust, once it substitutes for verification, is the easiest thing in the world to counterfeit. That's the story of Bernie Madoff. A lie that lasted decades, hiding behind a name everyone thought they could trust. Every source for this video is linked below. Go read the record yourself. Follow the money.